We are moving into the last quarter of the class, which is the mid-1950s on. Some of this is familiar to many of you. Hopefully we have a grasp on this. We're not talking about ancient history here. So I am working today with the 50s. The other half of the 50s will be the beginning of the civil rights movement, which I'll talk about in the next video, but I want to lay the groundwork for the 50s. 50s is a very interesting time. It's very much like the 1920s, where you seem to have surface prosperity, where everything seems to be calm and wonderful on the surface, but underneath there's a lot of other chaos going on. I would also compare it to until the coronavirus, what has happened recently, recent American history, where we seem to be in an economic boom most of the last 10 years, but underneath there are some real systemic problems. Some nicknames for the 1950s: the age of ambivalence. Ambivalence, bi means two, so ambivalence means kind of the opposite things in the same entity. For example, if you're ambivalent about something, you have opposing opinions on it. You can't really decide. Good name for the 50s. 50s is also the era of great prosperity, and this is where we get the term the affluent society. It is an era of contradictions, peace and prosperity on the surface, and underneath some real unease. One of the huge things that causes unease, of course, is the nuclear issue, because now Russia and America both have nuclear warheads. So underneath all of this is the fear of getting blown to pieces at any moment. Today, we might have hurricane drills, we might have active shooter drills. Unfortunately, in the 1950s, we didn't have that. When I was a little kid growing up, we had nuclear drills. We had, unbelievably, drills to prepare for nuclear warfare. If you ask your grandparents or something around that age, ask them about this. In their elementary school, we had duck and cover drills where we would crawl underneath our desks and put our hands over our heads. I was 6, 7 years old, and I knew at 6, 7 years old, this isn't going to do much in the event of a nuclear attack. So why are they doing this? To make us feel that we have some power, that we have some control, which we really didn't. Same thing happened after 9/11, when I remember George Bush got on the air and told everybody to go out and buy duct tape and plastic because we were worried about chemical warfare and biological attacks, and we could tape up our windows in the event of some kind of an event. We didn't know after 9/11. And we're watching this on TV, and one of my 9-year-old son turns to me and said, "If you use duct tape and plastic, aren't you going to suffocate after a while?" Yeah. So why are we doing this? To make us feel that we have some control, that we can do something about it, which of course we really didn't either at the time. So 1950s, this is the affluent society. This is perhaps the best economic times in American history. And Americans were called the people of plenty. We had plenty at the time. And this is why many Americans today are nostalgic and want to go back to the 1950s. If you're an adult white male, it's a great time. The war raised the American living standards to the highest in the world. It left Europe exhausted, devastated. The middle class, most Americans were middle class or better. It almost eliminated poverty in America. Everybody had jobs, and pretty good jobs. GNP went up 250% between the end of the war and 1960. The United States was producing 30% of the world's production. Productivity per worker went up 40%. How? Automation, technology, and a lot of this was technology that came out of the war and war inventions. Inflation was very low. Unemployment was very low, what it was until very recently. The GI Bill created millions, 4 to 5 million college graduates who immediately moved into jobs, who immediately caused the American economy to boom. And this is one of my hobby horses. Free education, college education is a great thing for the country, not only the college graduates. The 1950s are a perfect proof of this. People had a lot of disposable income, more income than they needed just to live on. Many moved from the lowest classes, the lowest 20%, 30%, they moved into the middle class because at the time, factory workers made good money. Unions were very strong, workers were protected. This is when you get the term the military-industrial complex. It became permanent. After World War I, we pretty much disbanded. We never thought we'd fight again. That was called the Great War. We never thought about a World War II. After World War II, we never drew down production. Why? Because after the war, we have the communist threat. We have the Red Scare. So we keep a large military. This is the first time in American history we had a long-term military, which we still do. First, the Russians, then Korea, then Vietnam, then Afghanistan, then Iraq. We have a permanent military, large industrial complex. Electronics begins to move. Some areas, like Seattle, like San Antonio, heavily dependent on defense industries and military bases. So this first slide in that 1950s file is the text, but if you look at 3 and 4, you have maps there, and what those maps show is 2 different time periods, and the shift from north and east to south and west. This is the rise of the South after World War II. Why? Because a lot of these military bases were built in the South because you don't want to have military maneuvers in North Dakota in the winter. This is when San Antonio really becomes a huge city. Parts of California, the U.S. Navy has the biggest station in the country in San Diego, for example. And military defense industries boom. Today, we have 3.5 million people who work in some kind of military defense related industry. This is not in the actual military, this is just in the defense industry. Hence the military industrial complex, business and the military working hand in hand. But this is a huge age of affluence. You had roughly 44 million families in the 1950s. Those 44 million families, I don't care about the numbers, just to give you an idea, owned 56 million cars. That is more than one per family. Today, pretty much one driver, one car, even more. Television sets come in about 1950. By 1960, you have pretty much one per household. And of course, it's a tiny little black and white, but it's a television set. And you only had 5 stations, 4 or 5 stations. You had in 44 million households, 143 million radios. So instead of everybody having a laptop, everybody had a radio in their room. You had, of course, coming back from the war, after the Depression, where people don't get married that much because of the economic situation. After the war, when the men are gone, first thing they do when they come home is get married. First thing that happens after they're married, because birth control is still hard to find, is you have families. And the first thing they do when they have families, because now every family has a car, is you buy a house in the suburbs. So 75% of Americans then owned their own homes. That's a higher percentage than today. On the other hand, the average home was about 720 square feet. This is roughly 1/3 to 1/4 of our average size home today, which is about 2,500 square feet. You are talking tiny little 2-bedroom houses. Parents in one bedroom, no matter how many kids you had, they were all in the other bedroom. So, the United States in the 1950s was clearly the richest country in the world. Today, debatable. Scandinavia, probably large parts of Western Europe are more, as a whole, more affluent than we are today. I would say Japan and Korea probably too. But America had 61% of the world, 6% of the world's population in the 1950s, and we had 75% of all the cars and appliances in the world. We also used 1/3 of the world's resources with 6% of the population. We have a better ratio today, but we still use way over the percentage of our population today. Poverty wasn't eliminated. 20% are still what you would call poor, and a good number of African Americans are still poor, but a large portion of the poor in the Depression moved into the middle class. There essentially were jobs for everybody and good, well-paying factory jobs. A good illustration of this, I think the picture is in your book, of Richard Nixon, who was vice president under Eisenhower in Moscow. He was sent on a diplomatic mission to Moscow. They had a big World's Fair kind of thing, and every nation had a pavilion. And in the American pavilion, the American exhibit was basically a model kitchen with all the great appliances and electric stoves and a dishwasher and all these things that were new and shiny in the 1950s. And the Russians, who were trying to get over World War II and the deprivation they had there, were swarming around the American exhibit. The crowds were 5 and 6 deep. Khrushchev comes through the World's Fair and happens to run into Nixon outside the American exhibit. Khrushchev just starts tearing into Nixon. Americans are garbage, and remember the bad feelings after World War II because we didn't help them on the Eastern Front. Americans are garbage, that your children will all be speaking Russian, communism will take over the world, America is doomed to failure, etc., etc. Nixon doesn't say anything. He sits there very quietly, and when Khrushchev, the premier of Russia, finally wears out, Nixon turns around and looks at the crowds of Russians around the American exhibit of the kitchen and says, unless you can deliver the goods, communism is doomed. And who knew Nixon would be absolutely right in the end. So the 1950s is the great age of, what shall we call it? Conformity, I guess, is another name for it, or consensus. Everybody seems to be the same or wants to be the same. Everybody is married, for one thing. 97% of women and 95% of men are married. This is the highest percentage in American history. They married fairly young, 20 for women, a couple years older for men. And a new difference is, instead of an extended family, you now have nuclear families. This has nothing to do with atomic power. Nuclear families are parents and children. Up until this point in American history, usually there were extended families. You might have grandparents, you might have other relatives, you might have multi-generations in a house. We are now getting back to extended families very recently. Of course, coming back from the war, first thing you do is get married, and immediately you have a baby boom. And frankly, you guys are screwed, because the baby boom is the largest increase, a huge increase in American population, and we are now at the age of retirement. So we are retiring to the tune of tens of thousands, really a month in America, millions a year, and you are going to have to support us. And frankly, we're not dying fast enough. So the baby boom, birth rates go up 20% in the 1950s. They've been waiting through the Depression. They've been waiting through World War II. It's a long time. And there is a flood of kids. The average family had about 2.5 to 3.2 kids. In other words, 3 kids was the average. The average today is 1 to 2. Much longer lifespans, medical advances. The polio vaccine comes along in the 1950s. Infant deaths dropped by half by 1960. So not only are there a whole lot of little kids in the 1950s, they're going to live forever. And that's why you guys have a problem. We are not dying out fast enough. Where do they live? In suburbs. Suburbs by 1960 have 1/3 of the population. Suburbs grew by about 50%. Cheap houses, cheap cars. They were usually built without sidewalks because people didn't walk, you drove. Age of conformity, everybody's married, everybody has the same amount of kids, everybody living in very similar situations. Immigrants are not as prominent as they used to be. Remember, in 1924, we cut off immigrants, and after the war, it loosens a little bit, but not much. So these immigrants that had come in the early 1900s, their children, their grandchildren are now Americans. You don't see in the 1950s as many foreigners as you did, let's say, in 1910 or 1920. So again, it's homogenous, much more. The image of television is a good example of this. If you have never seen a Leave It to Beaver episode, or even better, Andy Griffith episode, Happy Days, I Love Lucy, these are the ideal images, the ideal family. Nuclear families, Andy Griffith is a wonderful example. Small town life. The biggest problems in Mayberry, in Andy Griffith's show, is somebody getting a parking ticket. Compare that to television shows today. The town drunk in Mayberry lets himself into the jail every Friday night. He knows where the keys are and lets himself out every Saturday morning. This is a whole different world with very few serious problems. The 1950s are also the Eisenhower decade. And if you look at slide 6 there and slide 7, you have a snapshot of Eisenhower. Eisenhower's first name was Dwight. He was immediately called Ike. His campaign slogan, I like Ike. Everybody did. Does I like Ike tell you very much about his political positions? Absolutely not. He didn't have too many. So what is important to remember about Eisenhower? He's a good symbol of the 1950s. He won in a landslide both times. This is a guy who was born fairly poor, rural, I think Kansas it was, but rural farm family, went to West Point, didn't graduate high in his class in West Point, and requested to go in the infantry. One great story that I think is a real snapshot of Eisenhower and explains him, when he was a little kid, his job on the farm was to go out and feed the poultry. So he had chickens and ducks and geese. If you've ever been around geese are real aggressive and really nasty. They can do some damage. They'll come after you. So here's this little 5-6-year-old kid, and his job was to feed the geese. And there was a big male goose in the barnyard that the minute he entered the fence would chase him and bite him. And he said, I don't want to feed the geese. His father said, you go out there, you feed the geese, that's your job. So he figured out pretty quickly the way to feed the poultry was to go into the barnyard with a pail full of grain and a broom. That goose came after him. Eisenhower took the broom and whacked the goose upside the head. Goose never came after him again. It's a good snapshot of Eisenhower's basic philosophy. And this is literally walk softly and carry a big stick. He's a very calm, quiet, non-abrasive, genial guy. He became commander of Allied forces in World War II. There were other people with seniority, but he's the guy who got along with everybody when others didn't. He didn't have as big an ego as some of the other generals. He was confident, strong character. He shared the credit for the successes. He took the blame for all the military failures. I think this is a very significant fact of Eisenhower. For 3 years, when he's in charge of American troops, he was called the general who hated war. He knew war firsthand. He knew the damage war did. Part of this is for 3 years, he signed personally every death notice of every American soldier. And there were tens of thousands. So he knew about war, and he was very serious about war. He was a great organizer. He works well with experts, very smart, but very calm, very quiet, easily underestimated. He was one of the best poker players the U.S. Army has ever seen. In fact, in World War II, the U.S. Army banned him from playing poker because he won every hand he played. As president, again, calm, non-confrontational, very moderate. He is a Republican, so he's trying to draw down the U.S. government and make it smaller. His sport, he's the guy who introduced golf. Presidents play golf now, most of them. Golf is a perfect sport for Eisenhower. It's very calm, it's slow, it's not football, which is very competitive, where you have a lot of smashing and banging. He didn't want to run as president, but he's a war hero. Again, he was nominated by the Republicans, and he figures, okay, what could be worse after World War II? He had no political background, no political experience. On the other hand, he managed the Allied invasions in World War II, so he's a good manager and a good supervisor. He had those talents. He did not deal with Douglas MacArthur. He hated him. Truman is the guy who removed Douglas MacArthur. He disliked Joe McCarthy, but he did nothing about Joe McCarthy and could have probably shut him down. He said, I'm not getting in the gunner with that guy. He opposed integrating the Army after Truman did it when he was head of the Army, but he's the guy who sent troops into Little Rock to integrate the school there. He had never been in a church before he became president, but he joined a church immediately and began to openly go to church. Why? This is the 1950s. Everybody has little kids. Everybody is going to church. This is also the period when one nation under God is added to the Pledge of Allegiance. Before it, under God was not there. Why did we add it in? Because communism is atheism, and we wanted to distinguish that. This is a quote from Eisenhower. Our government makes no sense unless it is founded on a deep religious faith, and I don't care what that faith is. You don't care which church you're going to, as long as you're going to church. So his presidency, which is that first slide again, he is a conservative, economically conservative, no big programs. He doesn't oppose the New Deal programs. He continues most of them, very pro-business, as Republicans still are today. His motto was, what's good for GM is good for America. And his cabinet, his advisors, were called 8 millionaires and a plumber. He had 3 on his cabinet. This is true. He had 3 executives from GM, 5 other conservative businessmen, and the head of the plumbers union. So of the 9, 8 were conservative businessmen. His goal, trying to balance the budget. How do you balance the budget? You have to cut spending. And he was trying to cut defense spending, not very successful because you have the military-industrial complex. These businesses had contracts with the U.S. government. It is Eisenhower who says, be careful of the military-industrial complex. His one signature achievement as president was, as you can see, let me see what slides they are, 8 and 9, was the U.S. Highway Act. This was 1956, after he is reelected. Why was he concerned with highways? In World War I, when he was a very junior officer, he was given the assignment to take a convoy of trucks from the East Coast, from Washington, D.C., to Los Angeles. So he had to cross the country. If you drive across the country today, even if you take time out to sleep, you can do it in 4 days, tops. At that time, it took him over 2 months. Their average speed was about 10 miles an hour. There were no highways. So what he had to do was to go backcountry road to backcountry road. He realized immediately this is not only an economic disaster, this is a defense disaster. We are a 2-ocean nation. In the event of a 2-ocean war, like World War II, we could not get things from one end of the country to the other. So he decides as president what he really wants to do is build highways. So our money was put into highways, starting with Eisenhower, not into public transit, not into trains, but into highways. This is the great age of the automobile. Remember, every family pretty much has an automobile. How do you pay for this? Taxes on gasoline, taxes on cars, taxes on tires, which of course still exist. When you build highways, they immediately create, wherever they go, growth. If you build it, they will come. And we've just seen that with the I-40 loop around Austin. Go to Lockhart today. It is right next to I-40, and Lockhart has changed tremendously. Only 1% of this tax money was spent on mass transit. 99% was spent on highways, and we're still dealing with the effects of that. He did increase the minimum wage. He did do a little bit for social services. He did not cut New Deal programs that were in place, but this was not his interest. He ended up with bigger deficits than Truman had. So what's important about that is only his highways. The other part that's important about Eisenhower, much more important than what he does here, is what happens overseas. And I'll continue with that in the next video. Thanks, and stay safe.